Hello, and welcome to Lyla's Lullabies, where we spend time exploring with Lyla, a traveler who wanders the world at her own pace, while sharing her most enriching and restorative moments with you. In tonight's story, we'll follow Lyla as she explores the vibrant city of Bangkok, Thailand. There's nowhere you need to be, nothing you need to remember. Just settle in, get comfortable, and let yourself go. We're so glad you're here. Whenever you're ready, let's begin. The morning air in Bangkok carried a particular softness in December, warm but not oppressive, with just enough humidity to remind Lyla she was somewhere tropical. She stood outside her hotel on a quiet soa, watching a woman arrange fresh jasmine garlands on a spirit house shrine, the small wooden structure painted in gold and red and draped with bright ribbons. The woman's movements were practiced and reverent, and Lyla found something calming in the ritual of it, the way the woman seemed unhurried despite the city already humming with life around her. Her friend Pedro had texted earlier to say he'd meet her at the Grand Palace entrance at 9. She checked her phone, still 20 minutes before she needed to leave. Across the street, a vendor was setting up a cart with fresh coconuts, their tops already trimmed flat, waiting to be cracked open and filled with straws. The rhythmic thwack of the machete against the shells created an oddly soothing percussion. Lyla decided to walk rather than take a taxi. The streets were already busy but not frantic. A steady flow of motorbikes weaving between tuk-tuks and cars, the occasional taxi painted in bright pink and yellow. She passed a small cafe where locals sat on plastic stools, bent over bowls of rice porridge, steam rising from the ceramic vessels. The smell was savory and comforting, a mix of ginger and pork and something green and herbaceous. She'd been looking forward to seeing Pedro again. They'd met almost 2 years ago in Tulum, at a music festival that sprawled along the beach. She remembered him sitting near a speaker with his eyes closed, completely absorbed in whatever was playing, and when they'd finally talked, he'd explained the layers of the music to her in a way that made her hear it differently. Later, he told her that he was actually playing the festival on one of the smaller stages, and he invited her to hang out and meet the other artists before and after his set. They'd kept in touch sporadically after that. Occasional messages, photos of sunsets, or interesting doorways. The kind of friendship that didn't demand constant contact, but felt easy when they reconnected. Now he was living in Bangkok, playing some local venues, but mostly working on his music. When Lyla had mentioned she'd be visiting, he'd insisted on showing her around. She was grateful for it. Bangkok was vast and chaotic and beautiful in ways she hadn't quite figured out yet, and having a friend to navigate it with felt like a gift. The Grand Palace complex appeared ahead, its walls bright white and impossibly tall, crowned with ornate golden spires that caught the morning sun. Tourists were already gathering near the entrance, and Lyla spotted Pedro leaning against a low wall, his dark hair longer than she remembered, tied back in a loose knot. He wore a faded linen shirt and looked entirely at ease, as though he'd been standing there forever. "Lyla!" He straightened up, grinning, and pulled her into a quick hug. "You made it. How's Bangkok treating you?" "Wonderfully confusing," Lyla said. "I've mostly been wandering around my neighborhood, trying to figure out what anything is called." Pedro laughed. "That's the spirit. Okay, ready to see some temples? Fair warning, there's a lot of gold. Like, an absurd amount." They paid the entrance fee and stepped through the gates. Immediately, the noise of the city softened, replaced by the shuffle of feet on stone and the low murmur of tour groups. The grand palace complex stretched out before them, a series of buildings and courtyards, everything meticulously maintained and gleaming. The main structures were covered in intricate mosaics, tiny pieces of colored glass and ceramic, arranged in patterns so detailed, Lyla couldn't imagine how long they must have taken to create. This was the royal residence for over 100 years, Pedro said, gesturing toward the buildings. Now it's mostly used for ceremonies. But Wat Pho, Kaew, the Temple of the Emerald Buddha, is still one of the most sacred sites in Thailand. They walked toward the temple, passing rows of guardian statues, towering figures with elaborate headdresses and fierce expressions, their bodies painted in vibrant colors. Lyla paused to look at one, a demon-like creature holding a club, its face frozen in a snarl that was almost comical in its intensity. "He looks like he's having a bad day," she said. Pedro grinned. "Yeah, guarding a palace for a few centuries will do that to you." They continued through the grounds, pausing to admire the details that seemed to multiply the longer they looked. There were golden jetties that spiraled toward the sky, their surfaces catching the light and throwing it back in bright flashes. There were doorways framed in elaborate carvings, mythical creatures intertwined with lotus flowers and geometric patterns. Every surface seemed to tell a story, and Lyla found herself stopping every few feet to take it all in. A group of school children passed by, all wearing matching uniforms, their teacher pointing out various features of the architecture. The children chattered excitedly, some of them taking photos with phones, others scribbling in notebooks. Their energy was infectious, and Lyla smiled as one boy accidentally bumped into a railing, and his friends dissolved into laughter. Inside Wat Pho, Kaew, the air was cooler, scented faintly with incense. The walls were covered in murals depicting scenes from the Ramakien, the Thai version of the Ramayana, each panel filled with tiny figures in elaborate costumes, elephants and battles and processions rendered in exquisite detail. Lyla could have spent hours studying them, but the crowds moved steadily forward, and she let herself be carried along. The Emerald Buddha sat at the far end of the temple, elevated on a golden altar, and surprisingly small, maybe 2 feet tall, carved from a single piece of jade. It wore seasonal robes, Pedro explained, changed by the king himself in a ceremony 3 times a year. The current robes were gold, draped in layers that made the figure look almost impossibly regal despite its size. They stood there quietly for a moment, surrounded by the murmur of prayers and the soft shuffle of people removing their shoes. Lyla found something peaceful in the stillness of the statue, the way it seemed entirely unbothered by the crowds and the cameras and the centuries of reverence directed at it. There was a timelessness to it, a sense that this small figure had witnessed empires rise and fall, and would continue sitting here long after everyone in this room had gone. Outside, the sun had climbed higher, and the heat was beginning to assert itself. They walked slowly through the courtyards, pausing under the shade of a golden stupa to drink water from bottles Pedro had brought. Everywhere Lyla looked, there were details, carved doorways, gilded eaves, tiles that glittered like jewels. It was almost overwhelming in its beauty, the kind of place that made you want to sit down and just absorb it all. "Next stop," Pedro said, checking his phone. "Wat Pho. It's a short walk, and it has the giant reclining Buddha." Also, it's the birthplace of traditional Thai massage, so if you're feeling ambitious, we can get one later. Lyla smiled. I could be talked into that. They left the Grand Palace and headed south, weaving through narrow streets lined with shops selling amulets and postcards and elaborately carved wooden elephants. The smell of grilled meat drifted from a street vendor, sweet and smoky, and Lila's stomach reminded her that breakfast had been hours ago. Pedro bought them each a skewer of grilled pork. The meat glazed with something sweet and sticky, and they ate as they walked, the flavors rich and satisfying. Wat Pho was less crowded, its grounds spacious and shaded by trees that rustled in the faint breeze. The temple complex felt older, more lived in, with weathered stone and moss creeping up the sides of chetties. Pedro led her toward the main hall, where the reclining Buddha waited. But first they wandered through some of the outer courtyards, where smaller stupas rose in clusters, each one decorated differently. These contain the ashes of royalty, Pedro said, gesturing to the stupas. Each family had their own style, so you can see how the designs changed over time. Lyla studied them, noticing the variations, some covered in smooth tiles, others textured with raised patterns, a few adorned with bits of mirror that caught the light. There was something poignant about it, these monuments to people long gone, still cared for, and beautiful. They entered the main hall, and the reclining Buddha was exactly as Pedro had promised. Enormous. 46 meters long, he'd said, and 15 meters high. It lay on its side, one arm bent to support its head, its expression serene and faintly amused, as though it had just heard a joke it found mildly entertaining. The soles of its feet were inlaid with mother of pearl, intricate designs depicting the 108 auspicious characteristics of the Buddha. They say if you walk the length of the hall and drop coins in the bronze bowls, it brings good fortune, Pedro said, gesturing to a row of metal vessels lining the wall. The soft clink of coins hitting bronze created a gentle, rhythmic sound, almost musical. Lyla bought a small cup of coins and joined the line, moving slowly along the statue's length. Each time she dropped a coin, the bowl chimed softly, and she found herself slipping into the rhythm of it, the repetition calming her thoughts. By the time she reached the end, her mind felt pleasantly empty, focused only on the cool air and the golden glow of the Buddha's skin. Outside, they wandered through the temple grounds, passing monks in saffron robes and tourists taking photos of the towering stone statues that guarded the entrances. There was a courtyard filled with small stupas, each one covered in colorful ceramic tiles, and Lyla paused to admire the craftsmanship, the way the patterns seemed to shift and shimmer in the sunlight. Near one of the gardens, an elderly monk sat on a bench, reading a book. His robes were faded from washing, and he had the kind of stillness that suggested he could sit there all day without discomfort. A small cat wandered over and curled up at his feet, and the monk reached down absently to stroke its head, never looking up from his book. Lyla watched the scene for a moment, charmed by the quiet companionship. "You ready for the ferry?" Pedro asked. "Wat Arun is across the river, and the boat ride is half the fun." They walked to the pier, a short wooden dock crowded with people waiting for the next ferry. The Phra River stretched out before them, wide and brown, its surface choppy with the wakes of long-tailed boats and barges. The ferry arrived with a low rumble, and they climbed aboard, finding a spot near the railing. The crossing took only a few minutes, but Lyla loved it. The wind off the water was cooler, carrying the smell of diesel and river mud, and something faintly sweet she couldn't identify. The opposite bank grew closer, and Wat Arun rose into view, its central prang towering over the riverside, covered in tiny pieces of porcelain and seashells that created an intricate, glittering mosaic. "It's called the Temple of Dawn," Pedro said, "but honestly, it's even better at sunset. The way the light hits the porcelain, it's like the whole thing glows." They disembarked and walked toward the temple. Up close, the prang was even more impressive, its surface textured with thousands of ceramic shards arranged in floral patterns. Lyla could see where visitors had climbed the steep steps partway up, clinging to the railings as they ascended. The stairs looked almost vertical from where she stood. "Want to climb?" Pedro asked. "Is it safe?" "Define safe." Lyla laughed. "Let's do it." The steps were narrow and steep, each one barely wide enough for her foot. She gripped the railings tightly, focusing on the climb rather than the drop below. Halfway up, she paused to catch her breath, and the view made her forget her nervousness. The river winding through the city, temples and high-rises mingling on the skyline, the green smudge of parks in the distance. "Worth it?" Pedro called from a few steps below. "Absolutely." They didn't climb all the way to the top, stopping instead at a platform where they could sit and rest. The breeze was stronger here, and Lyla closed her eyes, letting it cool her skin. Around them, other tourists took photos and marveled at the view, but Lyla was content to just sit, feeling the stillness of the temple contrasted with the motion of the river below. A vendor's boat passed by on the water, loaded with fresh fruit, and Lyla could see the bright colors even from this height: mangoes and dragon fruit, and something purple she didn't recognize. The vendor waved up at the temple, though whether at anyone specific or just as a general greeting, Lyla couldn't tell. When they finally descended, her legs were shaky and she was ready for lunch. Pedro led her to a small restaurant near the pier, a simple place with plastic chairs and laminated menus, the kind of spot that clearly catered to locals. The owner, a woman with graying hair and a quick smile, greeted Pedro in Thai, and he responded easily, his accent good enough that Lyla suspected he'd been practicing. They ordered pad thai, green curry, and sumtam papaya salad, that arrived bright and tangy and spicy enough to make Lyla reach for her water. The curry was rich and fragrant, the chicken tender, the vegetables still crisp. They ate slowly, talking about nothing in particular: his music projects, her recent travels, a documentary they'd both seen about street food. "Bangkok's been good to you?" Lyla asked, watching him scoop rice into the curry. "Yeah, it has. It's chaotic, but in a way that feels alive, you know? Like the city's always moving, always creating something. It's inspiring. It helps me to create also." "Do you miss Mexico?" "Sometimes. But I think I needed the distance. This place is so different, it forced me to rethink everything I was doing, in a good way." The restaurant's TV was playing a Thai soap opera with the volume low, and Lyla found herself occasionally glancing at it, trying to follow the story through context and facial expressions alone. It seemed to involve a family argument and a wedding, or possibly a wedding that was causing a family argument. Either way, everyone looked very dramatic about it. After lunch, they walked to the pier for the Chao Phraya River cruise. The boat was long and narrow, with an open-air deck and rows of cushioned seats. They found spots near the front, where the breeze was strongest, and settled in as the boat pulled away from the dock. The cruise moved slowly, gliding past temples and hotels and riverside homes built on stilts, their wooden platforms extending over the water. Long-tail boats zipped past, their engines roaring, while barges laden with cargo drifted by in the opposite direction. The guide's voice came over a crackling speaker, narrating the sights in Thai and English, but Lyla barely listened, content to watch the city unfold along the banks. They passed Wat Arun again, its prang even more striking from the water, and then the Grand Palace, its golden roofs gleaming in the afternoon sun. Pedro pointed out other landmarks, hotels where famous people had stayed, bridges that connected different parts of the city, a massive shopping mall that jutted out over the river. A group of monks were traveling on a smaller ferry boat alongside them for a moment, and Lyla watched as they sat peacefully, seemingly unbothered by the noise and motion around them. One of them was quite young, maybe a teenager, and he stared out at the water with an expression of calm curiosity that reminded Lyla of Pedro listening to music. The boat made a wide turn near a bend in the river, and the guide announced they'd be heading back. Lyla leaned back in her seat, feeling the sun on her face, the steady hum of the engine beneath her. It was one of those rare moments of complete contentment, where everything felt exactly as it should be. By the time they disembarked, the afternoon had softened into early evening. They took a taxi to Chinatown, weaving through traffic that had thickened with the end of the workday. The streets of Yaowarat were narrow and crowded, lined with shops selling everything from gold jewelry to dried seafood to bright bolts of fabric. The air was dense with smells: roasting pork, sweet pastries, incense from a nearby shrine. "Okay," Pedro said, his eyes lighting up. "I've been waiting to show you this place. Chinatown is where I do most of my shopping. You can find anything here if you know where to look." They turned down a side street, narrower than the main road, where shops seemed to specialize in the most specific items imaginable. One sold nothing but ceramic teapots, hundreds of them arranged on shelves that climbed to the ceiling. Another dealt exclusively in dried mushrooms, the varieties labeled in Chinese characters Lyla couldn't read. Pedro greeted a few shopkeepers as they passed, and they nodded back, clearly recognizing him. "This is my favorite incense shop," he said, stopping in front of a storefront where bundles of incense hung from the ceiling like strange, fragrant stalactites. The owner, a man who looked to be in his 60s, was arranging sticks in a display case. Pedro and the owner exchanged a few words in Thai, and the man smiled, pulling out a small box of incense from behind the counter. He lit one stick and handed it to Pedro, who waved it gently, smelling it. "Sandalwood and jasmine," Pedro said, passing it to Lyla. "He blends them himself. I burn these when I'm working. Something about the smell helps me focus." Lyla inhaled, and the scent was indeed beautiful, woody and floral at the same time, not overwhelming but present. She could see why it would create a good working atmosphere. Pedro bought 3 boxes, and the owner wrapped them carefully in brown paper, tying the package with string. They thanked him and continued down the street. The next shop Pedro showed her sold traditional Chinese medicine. Jars of dried herbs and roots lined the walls, and an elderly woman sat behind a counter, grinding something in a mortar and pestle. The sound was rhythmic and soothing, and the smell was earthy and complex, like a forest floor after rain. "I came here when I first moved to Bangkok," Pedro said. "I was getting occasional headaches from the pollution, and a friend recommended this place, The woman made me a tea blend that actually helped." The woman looked up and recognized Pedro, saying something in Chinese and laughing. Pedro laughed too, clearly understanding at least the gist of it, and they chatted for a moment before he bought a small bag of tea leaves. "She remembers you?" Lyla asked as they left. "She said I looked less stressed than last time, and that I should get more sleep, which, fair enough." They wandered deeper into the neighborhood, where the shops became even more specialized. One sold nothing but buttons, thousands of them, organized by color and size in shallow drawers. Pedro stopped to look at them, and Lyla watched as he carefully examined a few, holding them up to the light. "For what?" she asked. "I don't know, they're just beautiful. Look at this one. It's got this little etching of a bird." He bought a handful of the most interesting ones, the shopkeeper counting them out with weathered fingers and placing them in a small paper envelope. Lyla got the sense that Pedro collected things this way, small, beautiful objects that caught his attention, building a personal archive of the city. They passed a shop selling old vinyl records, and Lyla and Pedro couldn't resist going in. The shop was narrow and deep, with crates of records lining both walls and a turntable set up in the back where a young man was listening to something that sounded like Thai pop from the 70s. The music was bright and catchy, with a horn section that seemed to be having the time of its life. Pedro flipped through the records methodically, occasionally pulling one out to examine the cover or read the track listing. Lyla browsed more randomly, enjoying the artwork. Bold typography, photographs of stern-looking musicians, psychedelic designs that must have seemed cutting-edge at the time. "Find anything?" she asked after a while. "Maybe. There's this one." He held up a record with a bright yellow cover. "I've been looking for this specific pressing for months. It's a Thai fusion album from the late 70s. They mixed traditional instruments with funk. Super rare." He took it to the counter, and the shop owner examined it carefully, nodding in approval. They negotiated briefly in Thai, both of them smiling, and Pedro paid, tucking the record carefully into his bag. They continued walking, stopping occasionally to look at displays. A shop selling hand-painted silk scarves, another with antique watches spread out on velvet trays, a tiny storefront where a man was making traditional Chinese dumplings, his hands moving with practiced efficiency. In one shop, an elderly woman sat behind a counter, carefully painting Chinese characters on scrolls with a fine brush. Her movements were precise and unhurried, each stroke deliberate. Lyla watched her for a long moment, mesmerized by the rhythm of it, the way the brush seemed to dance across the paper. Pedro stood beside her, equally absorbed. "There's something about watching people who've mastered a craft," he said quietly. "The way they make it look effortless, even though you know it took years to get there." The woman looked up and smiled at them, saying something in Chinese. Pedro shook his head apologetically, but the woman just gestured to the scrolls, inviting them to look. Lyla could see that some of them were poems, others what looked like proverbs or blessings, each one rendered in elegant black ink. They stopped at a temple tucked between two shop fronts, its entrance marked by red lanterns and a cloud of incense smoke. Inside, offerings of fruit and flowers were arranged on altars, and a few people knelt in prayer, their heads bowed. Lyla and Pedro stood quietly near the doorway, respectful of the space, before continuing down the street. "One more shop," Pedro said, "and then I think we should find dinner." He led her to a small storefront that sold tea, not just any tea, but what looked like hundreds of varieties displayed in glass jars that lined the walls. The owner, a young woman with short hair and glasses, was measuring out leaves for a customer, using a small brass scale that looked like it might be an antique. "This is where I buy all my tea," Pedro said. "She knows everything about it, where it's from, how it's processed, what it pairs well with." The woman finished with her customer and turned to Pedro, her face brightening. They talked for a few minutes, and Pedro introduced Lyla, who smiled and nodded. The woman pulled out several jars, letting them smell different varieties: oolong that smelled like orchids, a black tea with notes of chocolate, a green tea so delicate it barely had a scent at all. Lyla ended up buying a small tin of the oolong, charmed by the woman's enthusiasm and the care she took in packaging it, wrapping the tin in rice paper and sealing it with a small red sticker. Outside, the sky had deepened to a dusky blue, and the street vendors were setting up for the dinner rush. The smell of cooking food was everywhere: grilled seafood, stir-fried noodles, sweet coconut desserts. Lyla's stomach reminded her it had been hours since lunch. "Ready for dinner?" Pedro asked. "I know a place right on the river. They usually have live music." They walked toward the waterfront, leaving the densest part of Chinatown behind. The restaurant Pedro had in mind was right on the river, with tables set up on a wooden deck that extended over the water. Lanterns hung overhead, their light soft and golden, and a small stage at one end hosted a trio of musicians: two guitarists and a woman with a traditional Thai instrument Lyla didn't recognize, something stringed and resonant. They found a table near the railing, where they could watch the river and the lights of the city reflected on the water. A server brought menus and glasses of ice water, and Lyla took a moment to just breathe, feeling the cooler evening air, hearing the gentle lap of water against the pilings. They ordered dinner: grilled prawns that arrived still sizzling, stir-fried morning glory with garlic and chili, a whole fish steamed with lime and herbs. The food came on mismatched plates, everything fresh and fragrant, the flavors bright and balanced. Lyla ate slowly, savoring each bite, pausing between courses to sip her Thai iced tea, the sweetness tempered by the bitterness of the tea itself. The musicians began to play, their music gentle and meandering, a mix of traditional melodies and something more contemporary. The woman's voice was soft and clear, singing in Thai, the words unfamiliar but the emotion unmistakable. Something wistful and warm, a song about longing or memory or both. Pedro listened with his eyes half closed, completely absorbed. Lyla watched him for a moment, then turned her attention back to the river. Boats drifted by, their lights reflecting on the water, and somewhere in the distance a temple bell rang, its tone deep and resonant. "This was perfect," Lyla said quietly, not wanting to disturb the music. Pedro opened his eyes and smiled. "Yeah, Bangkok does that sometimes. Just when you think it's too much, it gives you something like this." They stayed through 2 more songs, the music washing over them, the river flowing past, the city alive and glowing all around them. A couple at the next table was celebrating something. There was a small cake with candles, and when they lit them, everyone nearby applauded softly. The moment felt communal somehow, strangers sharing in a small joy. The server brought them mango sticky rice for dessert, the fruit perfectly ripe, the rice sweet and creamy with coconut milk. Lyla took small bites, making it last, not wanting the meal to end. Above them, the lanterns swayed gently in the breeze, casting moving shadows on the deck. When they finally stood to leave, the night had settled in fully, the air cooler now, the city's lights twinkling along the river banks. They walked slowly back toward the street, Pedro humming one of the melodies from the performance, Lyla content to listen. "Thank you for today," she said, "for showing me your Bangkok." "Anytime," Pedro said. "It's more fun seeing it through someone else's eyes. Reminds me why I fell in love with this place." They found a taxi on Yaowarat Road, and Pedro gave the driver the address of Lyla's hotel. The ride back was quiet, both of them tired in the best way, watching the city pass by through the windows. Lyla thought about the day, the gold and the green in the river, the taste of lime and chili, the sound of coins in bronze bowls, the smell of incense and tea and night-blooming flowers. When they reached her hotel, Pedro got out to say goodbye properly, giving her a hug. "Safe travels," he said, "and let me know next time you're passing through." "I will, and you let me know when you're back in Mexico." He grinned. "Deal." Lyla watched the taxi pull away, Pedro waving from the back window, and then she turned toward the hotel entrance. The jasmine garlands were still hanging on the spirit house, and someone had lit candles that flickered in small glass holders. She paused to look at them, feeling grateful for the day, for the city, for the unexpected gift of old friendships in new places, before heading inside, already thinking about how she'd remember this. The warmth of an old friend's company in a city that felt, for this moment, like home.